Science is objective, right? Well, while we might like to think that we're objective, we actually bring many biases to our science. In this episode of Conservation Hackers, I speak to Associate Professor Vanessa Adams about the importance of recognising our biases. She's an expert in conservation planning and has applied these tools to help inform conservation everywhere from the tropical rainforests of Papua New Guinea to aquaculture operations in Tasmania. I'm Dr. Chris Brown. Now let's hear from Vanessa.
Vanessa Adams. I'm an associate professor in conservation and planning at the University of Tasmania.
And in all of your applications of conservation planning, it's always been with a focus on stakeholders. So have you ever been in any really sticky situations where you're presenting results to stakeholders that they're not keen on?
Yeah, lots of times. It's often just about presenting the objective science as a decision support. So you're not the decision maker, but you're often the facilitator. And I guess we use optimization tools to present a variety of really good options for people to consider, but ultimately they still are going to have objections or preferences. They're going to make them less optimal, but anything that makes it onto the ground is a good outcome. And so I guess that's, people who are really wedded to the solution are unlikely to get any solution on the ground. And so we have to kind of be ready to be willing to negotiate and to think about the science as a negotiation tool, and probably realize that we like to think of ourselves as very objective scientists because we optimize things, but ultimately we are still part of that process. Obviously with our own preferences around what the outcomes are and our own hopes and dreams for what might land on the ground and happen. So being kind of aware of our role in the process and being willing to kind of admit that we're there as a scientist and advisor, but we do have some kind of skin in the game ultimately.
Are you ever surprised about how your results have been interpreted into on-the-ground actions? Do you have any good examples of that?
I have all these dreams that they'll someday influence outcomes, but I think the lesson learned, and I guess why I research what I do today, is that plans are these sort of varied things that might influence the way people think and the way people act in maybe not finite or noticeable or attributable ways, but they still, by engaging people in that process, will eventually influence things. And so it's very hard to often track what we've recommended, particularly spatially, against what we observe on the ground. But having those conversations and sort of pushing those boundaries with people, I think often still does influence what they've done. I guess the one place that we've for sure, had influences in is probably management planning in Kakadu, where they have explicitly said, we've used your science and we're thinking through, and it's an ongoing relationship there. So while I'm not the main researcher there, our projects are still ongoing and we're still finding ways to update the models to better fit their management context and what they need to influence their day-to-day work. And a lot of those relationships are ongoing, so we're still trying to kind of update things. And so the fact that groups are still coming to us to ask for updates is always a good sign, but it's nice to know when the planners come back to you and say, like, even if they've only done a portion of what you recommended, but are still really trying to engage in the science, that's always a good sign.
And would you have any advice for newer scientists who are just getting into this area about how they can best communicate their results to, a broader non-scientific audience who might have a vested interest in the outcomes of development or conservation?
Yeah, I encourage all of my students, both my PhDs, but also my classroom students, to take this online survey available, which is it's changed names a few times. I think it's called the Future of Conservation, and so it's sort of founded out of some debates that were being had probably about 10 years ago now around are conservationists people that should be only in it for nature, or should we be looking to engage in the market and influence the market? So big people's names in the game were people like Peter Kariva, who were at the time articulating for the Nature Conservancy, we should be influencing businesses. So the survey has just been there to really study how people think about and how they themselves sit on this sort of spectrum of values, and trying to use that to typology the different debates happening in conservation. I think it's a really useful tool because it's quite interesting to see kind of how that data set is changing over time, but then you're more self-aware of what you're bringing to the table. And you always should be kind of reflective of your own value point when you're presenting your science. But beyond that, when you're communicating to a group, I think just being quite honest about who you are, why you did it, and what you hope from it is always a good starting point. And then keeping your messages really simple, like as simple as possible. If you know, most of us produce like hundreds of models with, you know, tens of thousands of maps. So you have to pick one, really. So you get one chance with one image and one solution and one recommendation. So you pick the very best one and hope for the best.
Thanks for listening this far. Just a quick break. Now, at this point in the interview, I had so many ideas about questions I wanted to ask Vanessa, I didn't know which way to go in. So it would really help me if you could, after you watch this, you could leave some comments about what sorts of questions you would like to hear in the future. Some people like to hear advice for early career researchers, other people want to hear more about the science, still other people might want to hear more about the personal stories. So let me know and I'll make sure I get these follow-up questions to the next person I interview.
I don't know. So the one place, like, so of the maps we've produced and of the priorities we've produced, I do think, like, I watch what's happening in Papua New Guinea and occasionally they announce things, and I've sort of talked to the practitioners there and asked them if they think the maps are still on people's doors and if they're looking at them. And so while we've not been able to say one-to-one, we've definitely helped create a marine protected area. We think there's definitely our work with the department at the time named SIPA, we do think that, like, they absolutely, like, you'd walk into their offices and they had the maps of irreplaceability in important areas, or their circle preferences there. And so even if it wasn't like a big win, they were sort of always thinking about it. And they do feel like having that investment at the time by the government to think through their structured priorities really did lead them to be more willing to declare and support things. So that's, you know, we feel like we had a role to play. We weren't the ones doing it, but we do feel like the maps really helped them think through that.
Yeah, you're almost providing like an education role, like saying, here's the data and here's how we think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just that process, because they'd been through the process a few times at that point, so they'd worked with a group of scientists to come up with terrestrial priorities and marine priorities. And I think by the time we got to them and we were integrating those priorities, they were just starting to really understand what those maps meant and how they would use them and their role in sort of making negotiations. So they were better understanding, I guess, the power of those maps. And they actually articulated as that maps are powerful and that data is powerful, and that they finally had something to bargain against, say, the forestry department or the mining department, because they then had their priorities and their places. So I think over that sort of longer engagement with a variety of scientists, they were coming to a point where they could use that to influence outcomes.
You've worked in so many different systems. How do you cope with the uncomfortable feeling of always going to a new system and, you know, not being an expert in that local ecology and of that system, but then having to develop these big spatial plans? How do you cope with that?
Well, I suppose I'm almost a generalist by training, and I think planners are that. So we're trained to understand principles of ecology and biogeography and species and humans and land use influences and sort of climate change systems. So we're sort of versed in interpreting many things, but possibly not mastering a lot of them. So that we master planning, and planning is our theory and our practice. And we sort of master how to integrate those multiple pieces of the puzzle. So yeah, I guess you become rapidly comfortable with, like, being the generalist and being in that integrating point. I guess over time, I've also become more comfortable with, in a team, saying, like, we're going to do this as a team, because that's what happens in planning. It's often a very large team. You're going to have modelers with really specific skills. You're going to have social scientists. You're going to have a planner in the room. You're going to have facilitators, you're politicians. And so, you know, it's, as the planner, you have to be able to interact with a wide range of data. You have to interpret it. You have to interpret it back out to people. You have to integrate it into optimization tools, and be able to make decisions around data quality and data error, and then explain it back to people. So you're pretty well trained as the generalist, but it takes a while to get used to being able to say, I am clearly the planner in the room. So essentially, you're going to give me a bunch of stuff, and I'm going to collate it and feed it back to you. But do not expect me to measure things. Like, I often have to explain to people, you would not want me to be in the field. You'd absolutely, like, not want me to be in the field. You may have the impression that I know something about a tree, and I will tell you what a tree is, but I will not be the one to tell you much about it.
That's great. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Chris. Cool project.
Thanks for listening to Vanessa Adams today on Conservation Hackers. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please don't forget to subscribe to our blog. And also please give us a thumbs up on YouTube, it helps spread the word, and share us with your friends and colleagues as well. I'm Dr. Chris Brown, and this has been the Conservation Hackers vlog.